On Fifth Avenue, in the dying light of the Gilded Age, a monster of stone and gilt rose to consume the sky. It was the most expensive private home ever built in New York City, a 121-room fortress born from a copper fortune and fueled by a desperate need for validation. Rumors of bribery seeped from its foundation while neighbors waged war against its thunderous pipe organ and the soot belching from its furnaces. The press mocked it as an architectural crime, a bloated wedding cake of ambition gone wrong. But the owner, a man who had bought a Senate seat and silenced his conscience, simply smiled. He built this palace not to be loved, but to be feared. Yet, within a single generation, it would vanish, crushed by the very city it tried to conquer. How does a monument to ultimate power become a pile of forgotten rubble in less than 20 years? And was its destruction a tragedy of lost art, or a righteous verdict on unparalleled greed? Chapter 1: Origins and Montana Fortune. To understand the monster on Fifth Avenue, we must first understand the man who fed it. William Andrews Clark was not a product of New York's polite society. He was forged 2,000 miles away, in the brutal, freezing shadows of the Montana Territory. He arrived in the West in the 1,860 seconds, a slight, a quiet man with the eyes of a hawk and the nerves of a riverboat gambler. While thousands of prospectors broke their backs chasing the glittering allure of gold in shallow streams, Clark saw the future in a duller, dirtier metal. The modern world was preparing to wire itself for electricity, and copper was the essential vein of that transformation. Clark did not just mine copper, he mastered it. He possessed a terrifying genius for vertical integration before the term even existed. He bought the mines that held the ore, the smelters that refined it, the railroads that hauled it, and the banks that financed the entire operation. He squeezed profit from every link in the chain, turning the raw geology of the Rockies into a personal treasury that defied comprehension. By the 1,890 seconds, his holdings were generating millions of dollars a month, a staggering sum that placed him comfortably among the richest men in human history. But in the rough camps of Montana, wealth was violent and transactional. It bought silence, it bought loyalty, and it bought dominance. Clark learned early that money was not merely a currency for luxury, it was a weapon. He ruled his empire with a cold detachment, unbothered by the smoke that choked his workers, or the ruthlessness required to crush competitors. He was a king in the wilderness, absolute and untouchable. Yet, as his fortune swelled to grotesque proportions, the isolation of the West began to chafe. Being a mogul in a mining camp was no longer enough. He craved the one thing copper could not manufacture: legitimacy. He looked east, toward the established power of Washington and the social elite of New York, and he decided that if they would not welcome him, he would simply buy them, just as he had bought the mountains of Butte. Chapter 2: Corruption and Senate Scandal. Clark's ambition soon fixated on the United States Senate, a body he viewed not as a place of service, but as the ultimate club for protected oligarchs. What followed was one of the most brazen displays of corruption in the history of American democracy. In 1899, Clark launched a campaign for the Montana Senate seat that dispensed with all pretense of voting. His agents fanned out across the state capitol, carrying satchels heavy with cash. State legislators were not lobbied. They were purchased. Envelopes stuffed with $1,000 bills were handed over in hotel rooms, back alleys, and even on the floor of the legislature. Clark reportedly said, "I never bought a man who wasn't for sale." The scheme worked. Initially, he was elected, but the stench of the bribery was so pungent that it drifted all the way to Washington. The Senate launched a ferocious investigation, dragging the sordid details into the national spotlight. Witnesses described a political machine greased entirely by graft, where a Senate seat was treated with no more reverence than a mining claim. Facing certain expulsion and public humiliation, Clark resigned in disgrace. Most men would have retreated to their mansions to hide. Clark did the opposite. He reorganized his machine, doubled down on his spending, and through a complex manipulation of state politics, reclaimed the seat in 1901, he returned to Washington not as a penitent public servant, but as a conqueror who had proven that the law had a price tag. However, the victory was hollow. The scandal clung to him like coal dust. The press branded him a villain, and the polite society of the East Coast recoiled in disgust. Clark realized that political office alone would not grant him the reverence he craved. Power needed theater. Wealth needed a stage so magnificent that it would force the world to look up. He turned his gaze to New York City, specifically to Fifth Avenue, the sacred artery of American aristocracy. He would build a palace so vast, so ornate, and so impossible to ignore that the city would have no choice but to acknowledge him. If his lineage could not open the gates, his architecture would kick them down. Chapter 3: Choosing Fifth Avenue and Buying Permits. When William Clark arrived in New York, he did not seek to blend in. The established families, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rhinelanders lived in a world of coded restraint, where wealth was whispered through brownstone walls. Clark intended to shout. He selected a prime corner of real estate at Fifth Avenue and 77th Street, facing the verdant expanse of Central Park. The price for the land was astronomical, a record-breaking sum even for the Gilded Age. But Clark paid in cash without blinking. The site was perfect, commanding, visible, and situated squarely in the path of the city's northward expansion. However, before the first foundation stone could be laid, Clark had to navigate the labyrinth of New York City bureaucracy. Building a structure of the magnitude he envisioned required a mountain of permits, 4 towering stories, subterranean levels, and complex mechanical systems. There were zoning variances, street closure, authorizations, fire safety reviews, and utility expansions to negotiate. In a city where every square foot was contested ground, this paperwork usually took years. Clark, however, applied the lessons of Montana to the clerks of Manhattan. He assembled a team of fixers, lawyers, and contractors who were fluent in the language of Tammany Hall. It was an open secret that envelopes changed hands in quiet offices downtown. Barriers that stopped other developers melted away for the senator. Variances were granted overnight. Inspectors looked the other way. The machinery of the city, much like the machinery of his mines, was lubricated with gold. Construction began in the late 1890 seconds, and it was immediately apparent that this would be no ordinary build. It was an invasion. An army of laborers descended on the corner, and the quiet residential neighborhood was shattered by the roar of industry. This was not just a house being built, it was a fortress being entrenched. The neighbors watched with growing dread as the excavation went deeper and the steel beams rose higher. They realized that their carefully curated enclave was about to be dominated by a man who treated city ordinances as mere suggestions. Chapter 4: Exterior Design and Public Backlash. As the limestone facade began to climb above the street, the full scope of Clark's architectural aggression became visible. He had hired architects who understood that their client had no interest in harmony or proportion. He wanted impact. The resulting design was a chaotic collision of styles, a fever dream of European grandeur stretched to an American scale. It was technically classified as Beaux-Arts, but it was a Beaux-Arts on steroids. The house featured a bewildering array of turrets, balconies, bay windows, and carved friezes. A massive tower loomed over the intersection, while the roofline was a jagged mountain range of copper cresting, dormers, and chimneys. Critics were merciless. The New York Times derided it as a grotesque pile. Architectural reviews sneered that it looked like a stitched-together monster, a collection of borrowed castles glued into a single, terrifying mass. One famous quip described it as the result of a Bavarian brewery colliding with a French wedding cake. The ornamentation was so dense that the eye had nowhere to rest. Stone faces leered from arches, garlands of fruit hung from ledges, and bronze flourishes caught the sun in a blinding glare. It was an aesthetic assault, a desperate attempt to buy class by purchasing every single feature found in a history book and pasting them onto one building. But Clark was immune to the ridicule. In fact, He seemed to relish it. To him, the criticism was proof of his visibility. He had not built the house to be admired for its taste. He had built it to be a landmark of his existence. While the old money families lived in their somber, uniform townhouses, Clark's palace screamed for attention. It was the architectural equivalent of a shout in a library. The sheer scale of the structure dwarfed its neighbors, casting literal and metaphorical shadows over the block. It was a declaration that the rules of refined society no longer applied, and that, the rough, raw money of the West had arrived to conquer the East. Chapter 5. Interiors and hidden machinery of luxury. If the exterior was a shout, the interior was a deafening roar of opulence. Stepping through the massive bronze doors, visitors entered a world designed to overwhelm the senses. There were 121 rooms, a number that seemed almost abstract in its excess. There were not just salons, but a succession of drawing rooms, morning rooms, and reception halls, each decorated in a different period style. Louis XIV, Henri II, Jacobean. The main rotunda was a soaring space of marble and gold, capped by a stained glass dome that filtered the light into a kaleidoscope of colors. But the true marvel of the Clark mansion was not its art or its velvet. It was its machinery. Beneath the gilded surfaces, the house was a technological wonder, a factory of comfort. It possessed a sophisticated heating and cooling system that required a massive physical plant in the basement, consuming tons of coal daily. There was a dedicated subway-like tunnel to transport coal from the street to the furnaces so that the dust would not offend the residents. A network of pneumatic tubes and electric bells connected every room to the servants' quarters, ensuring that a footman was never more than seconds away. The kitchen was an industrial operation capable of feeding hundreds, equipped with the latest refrigeration technology. But the centerpiece of this mechanical beast was the organ. Clark, fancying himself a patron of the arts, commissioned the Titan, a pipe organ of cathedral proportions. It had nearly 7,000 pipes, some as tall as a full-grown tree, others as thin as a pencil. It was housed in a dedicated chamber that required its own humidification system and a massive electric blower to generate the wind. When played, the instrument didn't just produce sound, it produced a physical force. The bass notes were so powerful they could rattle the teacups in the dining room and send vibrations through the structural steel of the house. This was the paradox of the palace. It was designed to look like a relic of European royalty, but it operated like a modern American battleship, powered by engines and labor that were carefully hidden behind the mahogany paneling. Chapter 6. Neighbors, Noise, and Conflicts. For the residents of Fifth Avenue, living next to Senator Clark was not a privilege. It was a torment. The Copper King had brought the noise and pollution of a mining town to the most exclusive zip code in America. The conflict began with the coal. To heat such a colossal structure and power its electrical generators, the mansion required a ceaseless convoy of delivery wagons. The clatter of iron wheels on cobblestones and the shouting of teamsters shattered the morning quiet starting at dawn. Then there was the soot. The smoke billowing from Clark's chimneys was thick and greasy, coating the pristine stoops of neighboring brownstones in a layer of gray grime. Maids across the street struggled to keep windows clean, and residents complained that the air tasted of sulfur. But the true declaration of war was the organ. Clark employed a professional organist who was instructed to play daily. The senator often wasn't even there to listen. The performance was the point. The sound of the Titan rolled through the heavy stone walls, crossed the street, and invaded the drawing rooms of the neighbors. It was inescapable. A dinner party at the Rhinelander house might be interrupted by a sudden, thunderous fugue vibrating through the floorboards. The neighbors lodged complaints, called the police, and wrote furious letters to the city. Clark ignored them all. When a delegation of residents pleaded with him to limit the playing hours, he reportedly dismissed them with a wave of his hand, suggesting that if they didn't like the music, they simply lacked the culture to appreciate it. The feud became fodder for the tabloids. Cartoons depicted Clark as a musical terrorist, blasting his neighbors into submission. It was a stark demonstration of the new power dynamic. The old families had social standing, but Clark had the money to be a nuisance on a geologic scale. He had turned his home into a weapon of sonic warfare, proving that he could intrude on their lives whenever he chose, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop him. Chapter 7. Comparisons with other mansions and lack of second act. To fully grasp the tragedy of Clark's folly, one must look at the other palaces that lined Fifth Avenue. He was not the only tycoon building on a grand scale, but he was the only one who failed to understand the ecosystem of the city. The Vanderbilts had built heavy, stone chateaus a few decades prior, and the Astors had their own fortresses of privilege. But even by the turn of the century, those families were beginning to understand that the era of the single-family urban palace was drawing to a close. Andrew Carnegie, just a few blocks north, built a massive mansion that was simpler, more functional, and, critically, designed with a civic future in mind. Carnegie understood that for a building to survive in New York, it had to eventually serve the public. His home became a museum and an institution. The Frick Collection, another masterpiece of the age, was built with the express purpose of housing art for the people after the owner's death. These men were building legacies. Clark, conversely, was building a mirror. His palace had no second act. It was designed solely to service his own ego and immediate physical needs. The layout was a maze of private indulgence, ill-suited for conversion into a school, a club, or a museum. It was too weird, too specific, and too expensive to maintain. While other families were quietly selling their land or endowing their homes to the city, Clark stubbornly held on to the idea of a dynastic seat. He believed his children and grandchildren would live there forever, reigning over New York from the turreted tower. He miscalculated the trajectory of history. He didn't see that the income tax was coming, that the servant class was disappearing, and that the sheer impracticality of a 121-room house in the middle of a modernizing metropolis would turn his monument into a white elephant. Other mansions survived because they adapted. Clark's palace was a dinosaur from the moment the last stone was set. Too big to hide, too hungry to feed, and too stubborn to evolve. Chapter 8. Economic Burden, Sale and Demolition. William Clark died in 1925, a wizened old man of 86. He passed away inside the monster he had created, leaving behind a complicated will and a fortune that was immediately besieged by the taxman. The palace passed to his heirs, but along with the deed came a terrifying financial reality. The Gilded Age was over. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing, and the economics of real estate had shifted violently. The land beneath the mansion was now worth significantly more than the house itself. Developers were clamoring to build tall, efficient apartment buildings that could house dozens of wealthy families on the same footprint that Clark had hogged for himself. The annual maintenance costs of the mansion were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars just to keep the lights on, the furnace fed, and the roof patched. For Clark's heirs, who had their own lives and no desire to live in a drafty, hated museum of their father's vanity, the house was a burden, not a prize. There was no sentimentality in their decision. They looked at the balance sheet and saw only red ink. Within months of his death, the contents were slated for auction. The art, the furniture, and the tapestries were cataloged and sold off. And then, the unthinkable happened. The house itself was sold to a developer for $3 million, a fraction of what it cost to build, with the express condition that it be torn down immediately. It had stood for less than 20 years. The Copper King had spent a lifetime accumulating the power to build it, and his children spent less than a year dismantling it. The speed of the decision shocked the city. Even the critics who had loathed the architecture felt a pang of unease. It was a brutal reminder that in New York, cash is the only permanent fixture. The demolition was scheduled, and the great bronze doors were locked for the final time. The fortress that was supposed to last for centuries was about to be erased before the mortar had fully set. Chapter 9. Birth of Preservation and Legacy in NYC. The demolition of the Clark Mansion in 1927 was a violent, public spectacle. It was not a careful deconstruction. It was a slaughter. Crews arrived with sledgehammers, crowbars, and pneumatic drills. The sounds of destruction echoed down Fifth Avenue, a grim bookend to the noise of its construction. Crowds gathered to watch as the copper roof was peeled back like skin, revealing the steel skeleton beneath. The wrecking ball swung into the limestone walls, pulverizing the intricate carvings that artisans had spent years perfecting. Dust clouds, thick with the ghosts of the Gilded Age, drifted over Central Park. The pipe organ, the Titan, was ripped from the walls and sold for scrap metal, its voice silenced forever. The interior treasures the marble staircases, the oak paneling. The mosaics were largely smashed to pieces. As the cost of salvaging them was deemed too high, it was a scene of industrial carnage. But in the violence of that demolition, a new idea began to take root in the consciousness of the city. For the first time, people began to ask, is this right? Even if the building was ugly, even if it was a monument to greed, did it deserve to be annihilated? The destruction of the Clark Mansion and the subsequent loss of other grand homes planted the seeds of the preservation movement in New York City. It was a wake-up call that without legal protection, nothing was safe from the logic of the market. The tragedy of the Clark House is that it died in vain. It was too early for the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which wouldn't be formed until the loss of Penn Station decades later. But its ghost lingered. The empty lot was quickly filled by a luxury apartment building, 965th Avenue, which stands there today. Yet, for those who know the history, the corner still vibrates with the phantom energy of the monster that once stood there. The demolition proved that a building without a soul, without a connection to the community, is defenseless. It was a $3 million lesson in the impermanence of ego. Chapter 10, Moral Frame. Visible wealth, invisible cost, and final lesson. As we look back on the strange, short life of the Clark Mansion, we must confront the moral weight of what it represented. It is easy to get lost in the numbers, the 121 rooms, the millions of dollars, the thousands of organ pipes. But the true story of the house is about what was invisible. The palace was a beautiful mask worn by a brutal system. Every block of limestone was paid for by the lung-shredding labor of miners in Butte who worked in darkness. Every velvet curtain was funded by a monopoly that crushed small business owners. The heat that warmed the ballroom came from coal stoked by men who died young. The house was a machine that converted human suffering into aesthetic grandeur. Clark believed that by stacking enough expensive stone, he could launder his reputation. He thought that beauty could redeem corruption. But the city of New York offered a different verdict. It rejected the bribe. But the moment his grip loosened, the city devoured it. The legacy of William Clark's palace is not in the architecture that was lost, but in the truth that was revealed. You cannot build a home on a foundation of guilt. A building that serves only the ego of one man is destined to fall. It had no roots in the community, no purpose beyond pride, and so it was swept away by the wind. Today, we fight to save historic buildings, to keep the memory of the past alive. But perhaps some buildings are meant to fall, to remind us that wealth without conscience is just a temporary arrangement of dust. Now, I turn the question over to you. Was the destruction of the Clark Mansion a necessary cleansing of a corrupt past? Or was it a cultural crime that robbed New York of a unique piece of history? Should we save buildings even when they represent the worst of us? Thank you so much for watching until the end. How did this video make you feel? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Empire Legacies truly appreciates your support. And don't forget, please like and subscribe. See you again in the next video.